For years, billionaire Richard Wakefield lived hidden away in his vast mansion with his only son Noah. The boy had been born silent and still, paralyzed, unable to speak, diagnosed with severe autism. Doctors failed, therapists left, hope vanished. Richard tried everything, yet nothing reached his child. Then, on a quiet, rainy morning, a new maid arrived. Julia Bennett, carrying grief of her own, stepped inside the silence. She brought no promises, only presence. What followed changed everything. The mansion stood far from the city, surrounded by endless gardens and stone walls. Inside lived Richard Wakefield, once one of the wealthiest men in England. He had left the world of business years ago. Money no longer mattered. His life was now dedicated to one person, his son, Noah. Noah had never spoken a word. His body was stiff, his gaze empty, his silence endless. From the day he was born, doctors filled Richard's home. Specialists arrived on private jets. Therapists came with books, machines, and promises. Richard paid them all, desperate for even the smallest sign of change. Yet Noah remained unmoved. Every morning, Richard sat by Noah's bed. He read aloud, described the weather, or spoke of memories with Noah's late mother. Even a flicker of response would have filled him with joy. But nothing came. At night, Richard stayed awake, watching cameras installed in Noah's room, hoping for a twitch, a glance, any proof that his son could hear him. But most nights ended in silence. Richard carried power and influence in the outside world. Deals bent to his will. Problems were solved with one call. But here, in his own house, with his only child, he was powerless. No amount of wealth could break the silence. Still, he refused to give up. His journals filled with notes, times, behaviors, details only a father desperate to understand could notice. He clung to one dream, hearing Noah speak, even a single word. It was during this long season of stillness that Julia Bennett arrived. Quiet, reserved, carrying her own hidden sorrow. She did not try to heal. She did not ask questions. She simply stepped into the silence with gentle presence. In a place where countless experts had failed, her calmness began to shift the air. Richard did not know why. But something small and unseen had already begun. The rain had not stopped the morning Julia Bennett arrived. She stepped through the tall gates with a single suitcase, her modest coat damp, her hair tied back neatly. Her eyes, though soft, carried shadows of sorrow. She had lost a child of her own only months before. Yet she spoke little of it. The agency had described her as quiet, reliable, discreet. That was all Richard needed. In the mansion, silence ruled. Staff moved efficiently, but rarely lingered. Doctors came and went, leaving behind complicated reports but no progress. Julia entered without questions. She studied the house slowly, touching nothing, observing everything. When introduced to Noah, she did not force a smile, did not attempt to shake his hand. She simply nodded gently, then sat in the corner folding laundry. It was as though she had always belonged to the silence. Richard, used to staff who tried too hard, noticed her difference. Most maids filled the air with chatter, offering ideas or cheer they thought would help. Julia did not. She listened. She respected the quiet rhythm of the house. At lunch, she stood nearby while Richard fed Noah. She did not look away from the boy, but she did not stare either. Her presence was steady, unforced, almost invisible. And slowly, the air inside the mansion shifted. The silence, once heavy, softened. Days passed, and Richard realized he ended each evening less exhausted. Noah remained quiet, unmoving, yet something felt lighter. Julia's small gestures began to matter. She placed a blanket across Noah's lap without a word. She cracked open a window to let fresh air in. She adjusted his chair when the sun shone too strongly. Richard saw something else. One afternoon, Noah's eyes followed Julia across the room. It was the smallest movement, but it pierced Richard's heart. Therapists had tried flashing lights, sound machines, games with colors and shapes. but nothing ever reached Noah. Julia, without effort, had caught his attention, not through therapy, but through patience. Curiosity grew in Richard. Who was this woman who could exist so naturally in his world of silence? He studied her file again. Nothing unusual, just a note of recent personal loss. He did not ask her about it. He recognized the same sadness in her that he carried for his wife. That shared grief required no words. One evening in the hallway, Richard paused as Julia passed. "Thank you," he said quietly. She looked startled, then nodded. "You're welcome." That was all. Yet the brief exchange stayed with him. For years, silence had been his prison. Now someone else understood it. Weeks turned into months. Staff whispered that the mansion felt warmer, less like a hospital. Julia was respected for her calmness, her quiet strength. She worked without complaint, never seeking notice, never demanding more. And Noah, though still silent, seemed less tense in her presence. His breathing calmed, his eyes lingered longer, his body less rigid. Julia began to notice patterns others had overlooked. Noah reacted to water. The sound of rain against glass made his fingers twitch. The running tap drew his gaze. A fountain in the garden made him lean ever so slightly. She did not announce her discovery. She simply began including water in his days. She wheeled him gently to the fountain in the garden, sat beside him near the pool, or left the window open during storms. And each time Noah softened. Richard watched from afar, unsure if it was real. But the signs repeated. One day he asked her, "What are you doing differently?" Julia shrugged, "Just letting him be near what calms him." That simple answer struck him more deeply than any doctor's long lecture. For years, experts had tried to fix Noah. Julia did not try to fix. She only stayed. And for the first time in Richard's long struggle, he felt hope. Not grand, not certain, but enough to breathe again. Noah did not speak. He did not walk. But the silence around him was no longer absolute. Small signals were emerging, signs that he was still there, waiting to be understood. It was Julia who had found the key, not with knowledge, not with wealth, with patience, with presence. Something was happening, and though no one could name it yet, Richard knew. The silence was beginning to break. Summer light spilled across the gardens when Julia wheeled Noah outside one afternoon. The fountain's steady trickle filled the air. She had learned this sound reached him in ways nothing else did. She sat nearby with a small book, not reading aloud, simply letting silence and water do their quiet work. For weeks, Julia had built these moments into Noah's routine. Richard noticed. He saw how his son's body, once stiff and anxious, grew calm near the pool or the rain. He began joining them, standing a few steps away, afraid to break what was forming. Noah's eyes lingered longer, his fingers twitched more freely, his breath slowed. One hot day, Julia decided to give Noah a gentle bath. It was not planned, only a response to the sweat on his brow. She filled a basin, checked the water carefully, then began washing his arms with a soft towel. Her voice hummed a wordless tune. Noah stayed still, his breathing steady. And then, it happened. A sound. Light, fragile, but real. A laugh. Richard, passing in the hallway, froze at the doorway. His heart pounded. Years of silence, years of waiting, and now, without machines or therapists, Noah had laughed. Julia did not celebrate loudly. She simply smiled and kept moving the towel with calm patience. Richard stepped back, his eyes wet, his body trembling. That sound, short as it was, had shattered a wall inside him. Days later, another miracle came. By the pool, Julia placed a small yellow rubber duck in a basin. Noah's gaze fixed on it. Then, with sudden clarity, he pointed. "Duck," he said. One word, clear and whole. Richard's breath caught. Julia repeated softly, "Duck." Noah echoed it again, slower. "Duck." It was not therapy. It was not planned. It was trust. From then on, Julia used moments of calm to introduce small toys, picture books, and music. Noah responded with soft sounds, sometimes copying words, sometimes pointing with intent. He touched pages, looked at images, followed Julia's finger. With music, he made gentle noises, attempts at speech, fragments of expression that carried meaning. Richard began to sit with them, clumsy at first, unsure. Julia guided him gently. Just follow his lead. He did. When Noah said cat after seeing a picture, Richard's smile lasted all day. When Noah reached for Julia's hand during a song, Richard's heart swelled. These were victories no doctor had given him. The poolside became their sanctuary. Julia arranged toys and books under an umbrella, sunlight reflecting across the water. Noah made new sounds: ball, moo, bar. Sometimes he said nothing, but his eyes tracked every movement with focus that had never existed before. Richard no longer measured progress in medical charts. He saw it in Noah's gaze, his touch, his voice. Hope, once fragile, now took root. But with hope came discovery. One morning, while cleaning Richard's study, Julia found a cabinet of old medical files. She opened them and her breath caught. The reports were harsh: aggressive treatments, heavy sedatives, restraints. Words that described Noah not as a child but as a problem to be controlled. Julia trembled as she read. This boy, so gentle, had been silenced not only by condition but by cruelty. She brought the documents to Richard. He sat down, silent, eyes scanning the pages. Confusion turned to disbelief, then guilt. He had trusted the experts after his wife's death, desperate and broken. He had signed what they suggested, believing he was helping. Now the truth lay before him. Noah had suffered under their hands. "I let this happen," Richard whispered, voice breaking. Julia placed the files down firmly. "Then let's do something now." Together, they organized the documents, building a timeline of treatments and names. Julia contacted a lawyer she trusted. He was horrified. Some of the methods broke laws. Richard reached out to a journalist who covered special needs cases. Within weeks, an investigation began. Yet inside the mansion, life did not revolve around lawsuits or headlines. Their focus remained Noah. Daily routines continued: walks by the pool, books under the umbrella, songs in the kitchen. Noah responded more each day, smiling, pointing, making sounds, even small words. The outside world called it a case, a scandal, a movement. But for Richard and Julia, it was personal. Their proof was not in court filings, but in Noah's progress. A laugh, a word, a hand reaching for trust. Richard, once defined by power and wealth, now measured his worth by his son's gaze. Julia, once marked by grief, now carried quiet purpose. And Noah, once buried in silence, was finding his voice, one word at a time. The silence had not ended, but it had changed. It was no longer empty. It was now the space between laughter, between whispered words, between signs of connection. And for Richard, that was everything. The hidden files changed everything. Once Richard and Julia uncovered the truth of Noah's past treatments, silence in the mansion no longer felt safe. It was now filled with painful echoes of betrayal. Richard faced his guilt directly. He had believed experts who promised miracles. In his desperation, he had allowed sedatives, restraints, and isolations. Now he realized his son's silence had not been a natural wall alone. It had been deepened by human hands. But Richard did not collapse under guilt. He chose to act. With Julia's steady guidance, he gathered evidence, organized files, and spoke with lawyers and journalists. For the first time, he did not hide his pain behind wealth. He used his influence not for profit, but for truth. News spread. Reports revealed that Noah's case was not unique. Families across the country came forward, describing similar stories of overmedication, harsh treatments, and children silenced instead of understood. What began as a private wound became a public movement. Through it all, Julia kept life inside the mansion balanced. She never let Noah's routine be swallowed by media attention. Every morning, she placed picture cards on the kitchen table, simple words like ball or water. Noah responded slowly but surely, sometimes with a touch, sometimes with a word. Richard joined, his deep voice repeating softly, read, play, blue. Each sound from Noah felt like a miracle. Afternoons turned into creative sessions. Julia introduced finger paints and large sheets of paper. At first, Noah only watched. Then one day, with blue paint on his finger, he pressed a mark onto the page. It was small but his own. Soon he smeared colors boldly, smiling when his hands left prints. Richard filmed with quiet awe. The living room walls, once bare, filled with Noah's artwork. Abstract swirls of blue, green, and yellow. Storytime became another treasure. Julia read slowly, pointing at bright images. Noah began to anticipate, turning pages himself. During one story about animals, he whispered, "Dog," before Julia reached the word. Another day, he laughed aloud at a silly picture. Laughter now visited the house often, soft but strong. Even the garden transformed. Julia blew soap bubbles into the warm air. Noah followed them with wide eyes, raising his hand to pop one. When a bubble burst against his palm, he laughed, the sound clear and free. Richard joined, clapping lightly, his smile unguarded. These simple moments rebuilt the mansion into a home. Toys scattered across floors. Music hummed softly in the background. Drawings covered walls. Silence still came, but no longer heavy. It was just space between sounds, between joy. As legal proceedings advanced, Richard was asked to speak publicly. For once, he did not appear as a powerful billionaire, but as a father. Standing before cameras, he admitted his mistakes openly. "I trusted too much. I thought money could fix what was never broken. My son did not need fixing. He needed understanding." His voice cracked, but he did not hide. Julia stood at his side, silent yet steady. The trial became a national event. Former doctors faced charges of misconduct and negligence. Parents testified. Evidence mounted. When the verdict came, guilty, the courtroom grew quiet. Richard closed his eyes. Justice did not erase the past, but it honored the truth. Returning home, Richard no longer wished to lock painful chapters away. Instead, he transformed them. He cleared an old storage room with wide windows and sunlight. Within weeks, it became an art studio for Noah. Brushes stood in jars, paints lined the shelves, soft music filled the air. When Noah first stepped inside, his eyes lit with curiosity. He dipped a brush into blue and pressed it onto paper. A smile spread across his face. That studio became his sanctuary. He painted daily, sometimes in silence, sometimes humming simple tunes. Blue appeared again and again, echo of the pool, the place where his voice had first awakened. Each color he chose carried meaning: yellow for sunlight, green for the garden, red for his toy truck. Through art, Noah spoke. Richard often watched from the doorway, resisting the urge to interrupt. He had learned that presence was enough. Julia, seated nearby, guided only when needed. Sometimes Noah whispered colors aloud: blue, green, each word a step deeper into connection. Life inside the mansion was no longer defined by sorrow. Laughter came easily. Meals were shared with ease. Evenings often ended with quiet talks between Richard and Julia in the garden. They spoke not only of Noah, but of their own grief, his guilt for the past, her ache for the daughter she had lost. They did not try to fix each other. They simply listened. And in that listening, their burdens felt lighter. For Noah, growth came slowly, but it was real. He spoke short words, pointed with intention, reached for hands when he wanted comfort. He laughed often, and one morning, during an art session, he drew 3 figures holding hands. He looked at Julia and Richard, then said softly, "It's us." Tears filled Julia's eyes. Richard nodded silently, That drawing, simple as it was, became their truth. They were no longer three separate lives bound by loss. They were a family. The silence that once defined the Wakefield mansion was gone. In its place was rhythm of words, laughter, paint on paper, bubbles in the air. Not perfect, not free of struggle, but real, alive and filled with love. And years passed. Noah grew taller, his face more confident, his voice steadier. He was no longer the silent boy locked inside himself. He had become a teenager with rhythm, expression, and pride. His story had spread across the country, inspiring families who once felt hopeless. One evening, an invitation arrived. A national event in the city wished to honor Noah as a symbol of resilience. He accepted. The night of the ceremony, he wore a deep blue suit, his favorite color since childhood. Julia walked beside him, holding his hand as cameras flashed. When they reached the stage, the host announced something unexpected. Julia Bennett was now Noah's legal mother. Applause filled the hall. Julia covered her face, tears streaming as Noah embraced her tightly. The audience rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some wiping their eyes. Richard sat in the front row, silent, but deeply moved. For years he had carried guilt, but now peace settled in his heart. His son was safe, loved, and understood. That was all he had ever wanted. Then Noah spoke. He unfolded a piece of paper, took a breath, and read slowly into the microphone. His words were clear, steady, filled with meaning. "My light started at the pool," he said, glancing at Julia. "Before that, I lived in silence. I didn't know how to show what I felt. But she waited. She saw me. And now, I'm not afraid anymore." The hall grew silent, not with emptiness, but with awe. When Noah finished, the crowd erupted again. Julia wrapped her arm around him as they left the stage. People reached out to thank them, to share their own stories of struggle and hope. Noah listened, sometimes speaking, sometimes just smiling. His presence alone gave others courage. Later that night, back at the mansion, Noah placed his award on a shelf beside an old drawing. 3 simple figures holding hands. The drawing had faded with time, but its meaning had only deepened. Family, belonging, love. Julia entered the room, and Noah hugged her once more. No words were needed. Richard, passing by, paused and smiled. The house, once filled with silence, now overflowed with life. Laughter, music, footsteps, gentle voices, all wove together into something unbreakable. The silence had not been defeated by science, wealth, or power. It had been softened by presence, patience, and love. And in that softness, Noah had found his voice. The past would never disappear, but it no longer defined them. What remained was a family, built slowly, carefully, through pain, healing, and trust. A family that had turned silence into song,